Hello. If you haven't heard it yet from anyone else, let me be the first to welcome you to AWP 22 Conference and Book Fair in Philadelphia. I'm Judy Wilson. I'm the Midwest Council Chair of the AWP Board of Directors. Here's a visual description of myself. I have shortish brown hair with bangs. I have red-rimmed glasses, dark blue sweater, red top underneath, multi-strand necklace, and this odd AWP lanyard with my name attached that keeps flipping every 30 seconds. I'm sure you don't have any problem with that. Let me also take this opportunity to give you a friendly reminder that AWP is still requiring all participants to wear your mask in public spaces such as this one. We're delighted to bring you this event today, and before we introduce our featured presenters, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our premier conference sponsor, Wilkes University Creative Writing, and PEN America. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. Now, before we actually start, I do need to do some brief housekeeping. If you haven't already done so, will you please silence your cell phones? Also, remember that there's no flash photography allowed during the presentation. And please respect the seats that are marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. And please give the authors about 15 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before actually approaching them to have your book signed. Lastly, we ask that you please be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 215-770-7291. The number is also on the back of your name tags. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Clarice Rosas Sharif, who will introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us remotely and in person. And I'll just maybe break the rules and by asking you, if you're in the room, if you want to move up a little bit so that we can really have a conversation with our fabulous speakers and writers, come closer. Let's just, we actually made it to AWP this year. We're wearing our masks. Let's be together. Let's embrace the conversation and the closeness. Thank you so much. So I am the Senior Director of Literary Programs at PEN America, and I have the very cool job, I'm biased of course, but of managing some of our major literary programs at PEN America, such as the World Voices Festival, the Literary Awards program, our PEN Out Loud Conversation series, some of our creative writing workshops and programs such as Dreaming Out Loud, serving DACA students and immigrant emerging writers in New York City. And I invite you to find out about all of these wonderful programs from my colleagues at the table and the booth. And I think I have a booth number somewhere in my remarks. I'll get to that. I'll say a few words about PEN. I'll introduce our speakers, and I just want to let you know that we have time for questions. So when it is time for questions, I'll come back to the lectern and ask you to use the mic on the right and the mic on the left to ask your questions so that those attendees joining remotely can hear the questions. So thank you in advance for that. So PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights. fighting for writers, defending their rights to speak and write freely. We celebrate, nurture, and protect the power of imagination in literary and creative expression, because it matters, and I don't have to tell you in the room. It matters here and around the world. We're especially thankful for our nationwide membership of writers, readers, and allies across America in our chapter cities in Austin, Birmingham, Dallas, Detroit, Miami, Tulsa, and a few more. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and New York, this is where our offices are based. Together, we work on unprecedented challenges to free speech. We call out the massive and concerted spread of book bans and dangerous legislative bills passed around the country. We also, I would be remiss not to mention what's going on right now. We have a war going on in Ukraine, and we stand with our international community of writers at risk, our Ukrainian writers and artists, journalists, who are literally on the front lines. If you want to find out more about our efforts in the region, again, my colleagues at the table will be happy to tell you more. Our booth, I found it, is 639. And if you want to join the good fight that we're waging at PEN America, you can become a member or sign up to be on our email list. So now, let's turn to today's program and introduce our speakers. Ayad Akhtar is a novelist and playwright. His work has been published and performed in over 24 languages. He is the winner of a Pulitzer Prize for Drama, the Edith Wharton Citation of Merit for Fiction, and an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Ayad is the author of Homeland Elegies, and by the way, Homeland Elegies is available outside with our wonderful booksellers. Please grab a copy, and you can get it signed after the event. As a playwright, he has written Junk, Disgraced, The Who and the What, The Invisible Hand. Ayad is also our current PEN America president, and we're very lucky to have him. Alexandra Schwartz has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2016. She is the magazine's co-theater critic and writes on a variety of other topics, from literature to cooperative grocery stores. In 2014, she won the Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing, awarded by the National Book Critics Circle. So now, let's turn to a conversation between Ayad and Alexandra. And like I said, you invited to come and be part of our conversation. If you have questions, please come when I come back to the lectern, and we'll involve you in. Thank you again for being with us, and let's get started.
Thank you, Clarice.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for being here. Good to be. I've never been to AWP, so it's really nice. So Alex and I met, was it 2 years ago maybe? A little bit less than 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was first summer of the pandemic.
Right.
So we thought we might be gently emerging, but yeah.
Oh, right.
Right.
In the July time. Like
Yes,
June, July.
yes.
So I got that once-in-a-lifetime call from a writer at The New Yorker saying, well, would you be interested in participating in a profile? And it was like, what kind of a question is that? Of course I'd be interested in. Do people say no?
Well, I loved your response because I am a little bit, I have the Janet Malcolm suspicion that Janet Malcolm, of course, famously said that journalists essentially want to, just get in and destroy their subjects. I'm paraphrasing, please don't quote me. Yeah. But, to be written about is a very vulnerable thing. And yes, I always expect potential subjects to say, are you crazy? I'm very happy with my life as it is now. I don't need to expose myself to further scrutiny.
Right.
I don't need public eyes on me. I don't need your notebook in my house looking at the art on the walls and the books on the shelves.
Right.
So you were like, come on in.
Yeah.
And I thought, good, I have a mark. That's perfect.
Well, I was familiar with your criticism and your generosity. I mean, your brilliance, but combined with your generosity, I've always felt sets you apart as a critic. And so I suppose I didn't feel as threatened. I thought, you'll be fair, But it was interesting. We got to know each other a little bit, and then over the course of the profile, and of course I was had a lot of anxiety before it went up, and then when it went up, it was really so wonderful. I was so surprised to find a picture of myself that was both surprising and recognizable. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's just a little bit of context of how we met. And I think it's a little unusual for a journalist and a subject, or a critic and a playwright, to maintain some kind of a friendship or something. So it seemed to be an interesting opportunity for us to be speaking about opposite sides, or also the same sides, because we're both writers, with a group of writers. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to kind of meander a little bit. And just talk about the writing life, talk about life in the theater from the point of view of an artist in the theater, or from the point of view of a critic in the theater. And then I have some questions about criticism per se that I want to engage you with, and I suspect you may have some questions you want to engage me with. So.
Correct.
Can I start by asking you a question?
You know what? Nothing would relax me more.
Okay.
Just turn the tables.
Good. So how did you, you won the Balakian in 2014, that's 7 years ago. You have had an extraordinary career already, and you are so young. How did you get started? Can you give me the sort of thumbnail sketch of you wanting to be a writer, becoming a writer, finding a place at the New Yorker, and then expanding out to now writing about books, TV, cultural criticism, profiles, art world. There is maybe not a critic that writes as expansively about so many different things at work in the country today. Talk me through that journey.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's wonderfully affirming, and to be seen through your eyes is so flattering and generous. So I appreciate that. Both of us are we're restless creatures, I think. We're genre restless, we're subject restless. I do think that's something that we have in common, and that I, of course, got to explore about you for a public audience. But yes, how did I get started? Do we want to begin as a young child when I thought, the written word, which I'm sure is a feeling that everybody in this room had? I'm not going to begin there. I will begin at a different beginning point, which is when I discovered that you could write seriously and think seriously about books specifically for a non-academic audience. That was like a lightning bulb, thrilling, exciting moment. I was in college. Of course, I had read magazines like The New Yorker, The New Republic, on and on. Growing up in New York City, I was exposed to a lot of that, which was extremely lucky. But in college, at the same time as I was discovering one track, the academic track.
What did you study in college?
I studied English literature. Surprise. But at the same time as I was discovering that track and very drawn to that as a way of thinking seriously about some of the stuff that mattered most to me, I discovered that there were a bunch of critics around the country who were thinking really seriously, but for an audience that is thought of, and I like to think of as the common reader, meaning someone who is interested, engaged, wants to engage with a broad variety of subject matters, much often like these writers. And you don't have to be super specialized. You don't have to go into the archives and find the one, strand of hair that Jane Austen left. Not to stereotype about academics. Sorry, academics, we love you and appreciate you. But to me, it felt like an opening rather than a narrowing of the world. I was worried that going into, or just an academic path might constitute a narrowing. Doesn't always, but I think it can. And I wanted to expand. I had a professor, Bill Derezowitz, you may have heard of some of his books, who was writing for The Nation and was writing criticism for The Nation. And I started subscribing to The Nation, and it blew my mind. It helped that my politics were aligned with the politics of the magazine, but I blew past all that and went to the cultural pages at the back of the magazine, and just saw writers like Bill and others engaging.
Who else?
At that point, it's such a good question. Who else? At that point, also reading The New Yorker at the same time, I will drop one of my absolute all-time favorites, Joan Acocella. Just people who think critically, intelligently, and also humorously. Humor for me is a huge value in life and in criticism and writing and just approach of all kinds. And I started to think, oh, well, that's interesting. So maybe I should get an internship at this place, The Nation, because I have no plans for graduation. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. Very conveniently, the economy of the United States and the world has just collapsed. This was in 2009. So there's all the pressure on my shoulders and no pressure on my shoulders because everyone's life is just going up in smoke. There was something terrifying and freeing about that. And I ended up eventually writing for The Nation. That's the long, short answer of how I got into criticism. And the terrifying thing about doing that
Were you writing book reviews?
Yes. And the first book review I wrote, I actually remember talking about this in my Balakian speech, was a book of short stories by the fabulous Russian writer Lyudmila Petrushevskaya, who wrote in secret throughout the Soviet regime, who used to stash her scribblings in her desk. And after the collapse of the USSR, they could be pulled from the desk. We could discover that this unbelievable writer had been in our midst, but secretly, as I think is the case in repressive regimes around the world, and certainly in that one. And I thought, well, this is ideal. I know really nothing about contemporary Russian literature. I have no degree. I have no authority to write about this. Why don't I just expose myself and potentially humiliate myself and try doing that? I mean, there is the question of legitimacy and not authenticity, it's close, but legitimacy in all writing is interesting to me. And criticism, certainly, because the easiest question to ask a critic is, what gives you the right to say this about what I'm doing? And I think critics have to think really carefully about that question and ask themselves that question. Otherwise, you just get bad arrogance, which is like, bad calories or something. It's just, it's not, it's not the kind you want.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was so shaped by certain critics as a young lover of literature and an aspiring writer. Susan Sontag was such an important, formative grindstone. Mm-hmm. And Alfred Kazin, when I discovered him, Eric Bentley, all of those critics saw themselves as pedagogues.
Yes.
They saw themselves as teachers. I remember Eric Bentley, probably the greatest theater critic of the 20th century, saying that his job, he felt, was to hold a standard for playwrights to understand what was great. That in a sense, Eric Bentley didn't see himself even writing for the audience. He was writing for the tradition and to interpret and keep alive a vision of the tradition for those coming into it. Mm-hmm. It's somehow, I wonder what your relationship or your feeling about that is. There's an authoritarian approach, in a way, to that kind of ascendancy on the part of a critic. But there is such an extraordinary service that is being offered in, when it's practiced by a great critic. It seems to be a point of view on criticism that is not so in mode anymore. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think that is, or whether you think that's a good thing, or whether I'm wrong about that and there are people who are doing that.
What a fascinating question. I think that as a critic, you write for multiple audiences. Probably, as is the case, I'd be very curious to know who, when you write as a novelist, your ideal audience, the person you imagine reading the book is.
You're on the hot seat right now.
Okay. I'm just dropping it so we can return to it like, Hansel and Gretel with the breadcrumbs. We're going to make our way back. All right, fair enough. Well, there are different audiences that you're writing for. You're, of course, writing for the reading public, but are you also writing for the artists whose work you're responding to directly? And if you are writing for them, are you writing from a position of trying to instruct them, which is a very interesting position for a critic to be in, a presumptuous position, But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be good, I think, to be presumptuous. It can be good to be arrogant, but I do think those qualities have good and bad parts. And if they're not paired with a deep sense of humility, the critic has nothing interesting to say, most likely. You know, I think there has been, in a very good sense, writers may be more aware of their own limitations in the present and of themselves as representing just a specific point of view, a specific point on the much broader map of ideas, approaches, identities that are out there. I think this is a very good development. It's hard to come in as a critic and say normatively, this is good, this is bad. You know, I also think the ideas that culture progresses in, even just look at art history. This is starting to be questioned all over the place in art history, and I'm not an art critic, but I've been very interested to look at museums and critics rediscovering or really repositioning artists who kind of didn't fit into that narrative of we're going from impressionism to modernism to abstraction to abstract expressionism to, you know, there isn't a straight line. And it's fun to draw lines. I mean, the map is not the worst metaphor in the world. It's fun to plot because you can fit different people, different artists, different writers, different playwrights into many different lines across the map depending on what you're trying to chart. And I think doing that is a noble critical project. But I don't know if it's possible to come in and normatively say, you know, I'm forming my theory of the art, and here's how you fit in, and here's how you don't.
Right.
Of course, when you find someone who's just mad enough to do that, it can be absolutely thrilling.
Right.
It can also be enraging, which can be thrilling too.
Right. Clement Greenberg's and Harold Bloom's.
Clement Greenberg is a little bit out of favor these days, and I think that's one reason why. Yeah.
And I will say that I had the experience of sitting in class with Harold Bloom on a few occasions, and there's no question that pound for pound, well, that's the wrong metaphor with Harold Bloom, sorry. Minute for minute, I got more out of being in the presence of that poetic consciousness than anybody else I had ever met in my life. There was such a rich density of knowing, line to line. To read a poem by Elizabeth Bishop with him was just a different order of experience, and there was an arrogance that founded whatever that orientation was. I mean, I'm reminded of the review, I can't remember who the critic was that wrote the review after Jonathan Franzen's second book and said, yeah, you know, this guy's got some talent, but I'd like to see what he could do if he really did something. And Franzen said that was the review that gave him the chutzpah, the belief, the confidence, the challenge to quit his job and read Gaddis's recognitions and then write the corrections.
Yeah, I mean...
That doesn't come without a critic who's willing to say, I think I know more than you.
Oh yeah, that's very... Look, that's important. I think criticism... Well, I'm biased because I am a critic, but criticism to me is fundamental to a healthy artistic ecosystem. It's fundamental. At its best, it can bring out things in a work of art and expose them. Now I'm really going to sound arrogant, not just to the public, but also potentially to the artists themselves. It's a conversation with an artist. This is why I don't find it as surprising as maybe you do that we can be friends, because even harsh criticism and even exasperated criticism and negative criticism, and I have written my share of it, even those things I think are a response to and themselves a creative act. And absolutely, you know, if you're in this game, any part of it, you're there for the love of the game. You want to see people doing their best work, and you want to know what that work can be. You know, I think, because we were just talking about being a young critic, when you're a young critic, you're obviously trying to form your own taste, and you're using work that's out there as a bit of a file against which you can file your taste. You can find out what you like, what you don't like, and you have to understand what your responses are to both of those things. Why do I like this? Why do I not? then you start to know more. You start to read more. If you're a theater critic, you start to see more. And the more you know and the more you learn about the world and the work in it, the more authority you gather. You know, I think it's an interesting thing to wonder, is there a point when people can feel that they're so ensconced in authority that they can forget some of the fundamental curiosity that a critic needs to have? And humility, again, I think is a necessary quality to balance. It is arrogant to be a critic. You're getting out there and you're giving your opinion. But what gives you the right to give your opinion? I don't think that much. Having an opinion is an okay reason. But again, you've got to know what you don't know.
Right.
Does that sound too mystic?
No. It's
kind of out there.
It makes me wonder a couple of things. One of the things that it makes me wonder, and I really want to know some of these things. So
okay, because I have some. I
that's fine.
now have some questions for you, by the way.
We'll get to that.
All right.
To that. So as you are growing or developing or writing and seeing more and learning more and sort of knowing more, and are you conscious of a body of thought or a body of tendencies or a body of ideas and orientations that are the Alexandra Schwartz point of view? Are you in the process of curating that, however privately, to try to make sense of what it is that you are putting out there as a coherent vision of the aesthetic project of making art? And what's interesting in your case is that you're doing it across so many different forms. You're doing it with a deep understanding of the tradition, but you're also engaging with pop culture. And is there a self-conscious aspect to that of you sort of paying attention to the evolution, as it were, of your own thinking about this stuff?
You know, I wish it would be so nice to just say yes, because then I'd feel so proud of myself. So yeah, but in reality, you're there with a deadline, you're there with the work, you're thinking about it, you're thinking through it. Thinking through is my preferred way of thinking about things. And I think the best way to answer your question is I'm certainly aware of taste, what I like, what I don't like, what I think is valuable, what I might be inclined to think is less valuable, but also I want to be questioning my blind spots all the time. So I'm not trying to put together, at this point, a grand critical project that could be easily articulated.
But you may be recognizing that one is implicit or forming itself.
I'm not even sure.
Not sure.
I think of it more as a sensibility at this point, and I think sensibility is a powerful thing.
Yes. It
but one thing I want to ask you, actually.
One more question.
Oh my.
I just don't want to. I don't want to forget this. Oh shit! I did forget it.
Perfect. Well, if you remember it,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, but because because you brought up the Franzen example, you know, yes, you know, I like to make fun of critics, and you know that's an example that critics might like to think of as they go to bed and wake up in the morning, just like, yes, I produced this novel, but I'm curious about your own reactions to criticism that you've gotten, and if there has been either an equivalent moment, a wake-up call kind of moment. I mean, I think what you were describing before, I also think a critic can have a very important function just to see the work. I mean, you were talking about that in my profile of you. You want to see accurately. That's a lot harder, I think, than it sounds.
Yeah.
Whether you're writing about a person or about something a person has produced, just to see the thing accurately is difficult. But
Right.
you know, what about critical responses to your work?
I think criticism is an essential part of the process, especially making theater. I always say that it's not until the second production that I know I know what I'm doing. The first production is a fact-finding mission and accumulating a lot of knowledge. Previews is the first time that you're really seeing the audience. I mean, one of the things that I have discovered in the years of making theater is that readings are useless because audiences are not paying for readings. And when the audience is paying, there's a completely different texture to the audience's attention. That's the moment that I need. So previews are really the first moment where I get a chance to see what the show feels like. And one of the very few, if perhaps maybe the only good things about doing a show in New York first is that you get a good preview period. Off-Broadway, you get 2 weeks, and on Broadway, you get 4 weeks, which is extraordinary. And that is the first moment where I start to understand what it is that I've done and what it is I'm trying to do. And then the next moment is that batch of reviews. With rare exceptions, and you really are in many ways are probably the only one in New York as far as I'm concerned, I find that there's a lack of generosity in the critical community in the theater in New York. There's this sense that a work is fully formed, and it is an opportunity for me to make hay, me being the critic, to make hay for whatever personal project I've got. There are some remarkable theater critics elsewhere in the country who I think understand the ecosystem of making work in the theater, where a first production is not a production to be reviewed in the same way that a show going up on Broadway is. And that there is an opening for the critic to make some comments or to point the criticism in a particular way to help shape the work. Charles McNulty has done that twice for me with 2 different plays, and Chris Jones at the Chicago Tribune really helped Disgraced. So I would never have gotten that kind of feedback or help from a New York critic.
Can you say something about what specifically?
Sure.
Yeah, they
There was, I wrote a new scene in Disgraced because of some comments that Chris Jones made in his Tribune review. He didn't suggest the changes that I made, but the changes that he did, because he did suggest a change, made me sort of wonder about some things that led to this scene. So in a lot of ways, just the fact that he was opening up the possibility that there was some unresolved or unexplored material led to that. McNulty, a really fascinating situation with McNulty, because I really look forward to him reviewing my work. He's like the person who somehow gets me and gets what I'm doing, and that I know he's going to tell me something that's helpful. Junk went up in La Jolla. It was wonderful. It was a career review, actually, his review in the LA Times of Junk, but there were some comments about what I hadn't gotten right that I then spent the next year trying to fix. And he was right. The show wasn't done. So that's my experience of being criticized. I will say, again, with the rare exceptions, and you're one of them, I hate you guys. I really do. I mean, I lie in bed terrified when you're going to weigh in on what I do. And if there isn't a sense of mutual investment in what we both love, if I don't feel that, then I feel the violence of it. And I recognize that, yes, I'm in a privileged position. I had a book published, or I had a play up on a stage, and so yes, I'm fair game. But you know what? Arthur Miller left New York because of the critics. Peter Shaffer left the theater because of the critics. Mozart basically killed himself because of the critics. This stuff is real to artists. And I feel like there's a lot of critics who don't understand that. And now we've become, because of social media on some level, we've become a society of critics. And in a weird way, this deeper sort of love, or the pedagogical dimension of what criticism can bring to, feels further and further more out of reach, you know. And I think, again, it is one of the things that I really so appreciate about you is there's a different spirit to what you do.
Well, I don't, in fairness to some of my co-critics, I don't think that my spirit is unique, although thank you for thinking it is. Yeah, you know, I also lie in bed in terror, and it, about a lot of things, but you know, I do feel such responsibility to the writers, the playwrights, the actors, to the people I'm writing about. Nothing is more intense, I think, and I think a lot of book reviewers feel this, even though if any of you in the audience have been reviewed, you may not believe it, because like Ayad does not necessarily believe it. What I just think of is the writer sitting alone, and I'm sitting alone. The writer has sat alone for a lot longer. The writer has been working on whatever they've been working on for years, potentially. And they've been alone doing it, because you get previews in the theater, you don't get previews as a novelist or as a poet. You know, if you're lucky, have an editor who can guide you or a reader who can guide you, but it is really you. And then suddenly this thing is public. And it's a huge obligation. I mean, this is why again, for me, such a fundamental quality of reviewing is just being able to see something and to see into it and to see through it. And actually, even what you're saying is making me feel a little bit better that I don't have an overarching critical project necessarily, because I really do want to be engaging with the people I'm writing about with what they've actually produced, rather than using their work as a jumping off point to make, to make a bigger point I have. Although, of course, as you go through, as you see a bunch of plays, as you read a bunch of books, themes emerge and things start to fit patterns. It's funny because I do feel very lucky to be part of a critical cohort that I think does have generosity at its heart. And I don't think generosity means you can't criticize something, but it changes the way in which you do it.
Yes, yes.
My co-critic at The New Yorker, Vincent Cunningham, also one of my favorite people and writers, it's, I think just being able to share the job in that way with someone who I think we're pretty closely aligned in the ethos of what we want to do is exciting. And one thing, it's been funny to come into theater criticism, especially from book criticism. We see each other. You see other critics on the aisle.
Yeah.
Don't necessarily interact with each other, but I'm seeing the other people with their pads out. And of course, now I'm also coming into a system that has way pre-existed me and isn't the healthiest one. Criticism is not flourishing. The Wall Street Journal's theater critic passed away, sadly, a few months ago. Terry Teachout has yet to be replaced. And there are a lot of demands, which I join, for a more robust criticism, certainly a more diverse criticism, which I think is to the benefit of everybody in the ecosystem making theater and writing about theater. And diversity in all senses. We need a lot of different points of view, and rather than an ensconced sense of, yay or nay. One thing that's really fun about writing for a weekly, paradoxically, my reviews are late. The Times has reviewed the thing the week before because I file my piece on the Monday and it comes out the next Monday and the show is opened. Right. But what's nice about that, in the beginning it was enraging, and I was saying, can't we get this up a little bit sooner because the Times is waiting? And actually it's kind of great. You get to think about the bigger things that you want to think about, and you're not just saying, yes, run to see this, no, don't go to see this. It allows me to do some of the work that I'm more interested in doing, so.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to continue this conversation about criticism, but I also want to talk about something else. So I think maybe I'll pivot off of it, and if criticism comes back, then...
Pivot, I'm so curious where you're going to go.
Well, so writing a profile. You've written some great profiles. Vivian Gornick, Miriam Taves, Jennifer Egan. You were just telling me about the Olivia Wilde profile that I haven't read, that you just wrote for Vogue. Again, as I said in my sort of brief preliminary remarks, I was so surprised to be both surprised by the picture that you drew of me and to recognize myself. And I want to read a couple of lines that really struck me, right? And I remember Annika, my now wife, as of 4 weeks ago, read these lines and she said, wow, she really nailed you.
I'm so curious what you're going to read.
He said something about, he exudes, and here's the quote, a confidence that might border on showmanship were he not so intent on poking at his vulnerabilities. And then you follow that sentence with an articulation of my customary self-deprecation, protective and perfunctory. Spot on. It's like every single nuance of, and it's not like I said any of that to you. We spoke five times, maybe a total of 8 hours, 9 hours. Were you watching me? And were you, I mean, what's the process of penetrating penetrating to the essence of, I mean, those are the exact words that describe the feeling, I guess, that Annika certainly recognizes, but that when I read, I'm like, yeah, that's right, it is what I'm doing. It is protective, it is perfunctory, there is an attempt to charm, and then there's also this kind of weird confidence, but that I'm always kind of undermining for my own sake to stay connected to something. So it's like all of that at the same time, you saw right through it.
Well, I guess you've now set a higher bar for me because I do want my profile subjects to be able to recognize themselves, but now I really want their spouses to be able to recognize them. That seems like the higher truth.
Yeah.
You know, I was watching you, Ayad. I was. And the watching begins early. The watching begins when we get on the phone. I mean, of course, I'm conscious that you're watching me too,
Right.
but.
And that I'm concerned, because it's the, you know,
Yes,
and
because
so
of all the
there
things,
might,
even though you were totally open, how can one not, I mean, knowing that one is being observed and that you're going to be written about, how can you not be?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, you were very fascinating nut to crack, also because you do have such experience in the theater, and so you do have an awareness of performance, obviously. And you were, I thought, very open and wanting to be open. Maybe now you can tell me some big revelations that you kept from me, but there weren't many.
We couldn't talk about the big project I was working on.
Which we're going to talk about, yeah, imminently. But that's I think that's okay. Yeah. I forgot what the question was.
I guess it was just me thinking back to those hours. You were asking me a barrage of questions. You're really paying attention. You're listening. You're making notes, and then I guess maybe it's really just to understand the consciousness that what is the moment, like is there a moment or a detail that locks in and you're suddenly like, okay, I understand something bigger about this person because of this detail? Is it the accumulation of details? Is it all of the above? I guess I'm just curious about the precision with which you saw me and how you got there.
You know, the other day I was on a plane and someone next to me was watching Ocean's 8, the female Ocean's 11 movie, and I've seen it, so I knew the moment that they were seeing. There was a moment when Helena Bonham Carter is wearing these glasses, and the heist is to steal this diamond necklace at the Met Gala. And she's
as one does.
As one does. Yeah. And she has some kind of guise. She's supposed to be inspecting the necklace, which Anne Hathaway, who's part of the scheme, is eventually going to wear. And she has these glasses on that, unbeknownst to the people who are showing off the necklace, allows her to take a perfect scan of the necklace so that her cronies can create a replica. And the cronies are all in a room together because it takes a certain amount of time. She has to kind of look like that at the necklace.
Yeah.
And it's like 45%, 46%, loading. And they're in the room being like, keep looking at it. We really need to get the replica. And I was like, oh, that's profile writing. Like, that's profile writing.
Right.
At the beginning, I go in and I'm like, 2%, 3%, 4%. How am I going to be able to figure out this person? I don't think that there's, a kernel to figure out inside of this person, but how am I going to be able to make the necklace that looks like the necklace?
Right.
And I would say around 30% you think, no, I'm never going to be able to do this. Like, we don't have a thing here. This is,
right.
I don't know what my through line is. This is stressful. This is, although, different people are different ways. And then suddenly, through conversation, through observation, through interaction, the picture starts to get fuller, and I start to realize that I have made the scan. And then the writing is where it comes through when you have to sit down to write. But it's stressful as hell because again, I have an obligation to you as my subject. I don't have an obligation to like you, although I did, so that was nice, and I still do, so that's great.
Right.
But I do have an obligation to try to get you, and.
Right.
And again, I think a lot really depends on the subject. Does the subject see themselves as a collaborator in that process? Is the subject resistant to that process?
What's it like when the subject is resistant to the process, or when they're elusive or evasive or dissembling in some way?
Well, I'm lucky in that I am most interested in artists, at least at this point, which is a frame I use really broadly, writers, playwrights, creative people, so I want to understand, how do you do what you do? Things that often the person may not even have articulated to themselves. How did I do that? For writers, it's especially inchoate often, I think. And of course, one of the great profile challenges of profiling writers is you can't see them do anything. Like,
right, you can't watch
there's a
sculptor make the sculpture.
Yeah, you can't go to the studio, or you can't go on set. There's a really great Larissa McFarquhar profile of John Ashbery where it opens with her just going to spend an afternoon with John Ashbery. And he's putting on music, and he's like, oh my God, I only have an hour left to write in the day, and what do I do? And he's shuffling papers around. He's doing all the non-writing that writers do. And I think it's such a brilliant way to capture what writing is, because you can't really capture what writing is. So I don't often deal with subjects who are trying to block my access to them. Right now, I'm working with a subject, I won't say who, but it will, who for reasons that I'll have to address in the piece can't share everything with me. And that's a really interesting challenge, because I'd love to go to certain places that for very legitimate reasons I can know about even off the record, but I can't share publicly. And I don't know yet how to totally wrangle that one. Yeah, right. So that's going to be interesting for me to figure out.
Interesting. All right, let me see if there's what else here I've got on my list.
Yeah, can I have permission to ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
Well, I do want to talk about the project that you just alluded to, because, I'm thinking about even the idea of freedom to write and pen. To me, writing is really a way of getting free, and you exemplify that by your creative restlessness in a good way. You're going from fiction to playwriting. Actually, I was looking at my profile of you again, and I was reminded that you had at one point written a 1,000-page novel that has never seen the light of day, which presumably had a very different audience in mind than something like Homeland Elegies. And now you're going to TV. You are writing a show that HBO is producing about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook.
And Sheryl Sandberg. It's really Sheryl Sandberg's the main character. Yeah.
And Sheryl Sandberg.
Yeah.
And I have a bunch of questions around this, but one that occurs to me, because we are talking about obligation to subjects. You're writing about real people.
Yeah.
Of course, they're really famous real people, and they're real people who have a huge amount of power over all of our lives.
Yeah.
But what is the obligation to subjects like Sheryl Sandberg or Mark Zuckerberg to try to get them? How are you approaching that question?
It's an interesting form that's evolved or sort of happened now, this kind of docudrama thing where the audience is also attuned to another kind of deformation through reality television. And so where the fiction and the truth of it lies seems to matter, and there's a kind of evolving metric for that feel, for the truthiness of all of that stuff. I was talking to one of the writers that I'm working with on this show, which is a very expansive sort of, I mean, I don't say this, I say this because it's an observation of what the material is like. It's a Shakespearean take on power as evidenced by the events at the organization and in the culture between 2015 and 2019, and what happened to Mark and Sheryl, what happened both to their relationships, but both also to them in this period where Facebook went from the darling of the world, promulgator of democracy and expression and truth to power, to being seen as the capital problem in the destruction of democracy, if you will. I think it's really important that whatever's in the show be based in truth. And if it's not based on an actual event, or if there's a scene that has dialogue that we never could have known if that dialogue was actually spoken the way it was, unlike Citizen 4, for example, that extraordinary documentary where every scene you know that happened in the Snowden tale is actually filmed, and so you get to watch the movie of the story that you already know. Unlike that, we don't have every conversation, but it's important that every conversation reflect the truth of what happened, what is likely to have happened. If you have 16 data points, there's really only one line through those data points. I'll give you a good example. In an earlier draft of the show, before I knew anything about this, I had enough data points to know that at some point Mark must have made it part of the corporate edict at Facebook that they were no longer going to pay attention to social optimizing for sort of moral or social reasons. It was clear that there had been a pivot and that had to have been an edict that was spoken by somebody, likely Mark, to someone else. So I wrote that scene. 3.5 weeks later, the Wall Street Journal reports that at a meeting in 2019, Mark tells, it's a meeting where the 40 top managers meet, I think it's 4 times a year, said, quote, we are no longer going to optimize for social good. So that's something that you just, when you do the research and you put all those points together, you know, I would have felt comfortable writing that scene before I knew the reporting because I had enough data to know that that had to happen. How I wrote that scene and to whom and with whom, that would have been, you know, that's where the risk is. And of course, we are dealing with a company that is oddly, I mean, a champion of freedom of expression that is incredibly litigious about any representation of them and have already been served cease and desist letters and whatnot. So,
and what do you do in response to those letters?
I don't, my goal and my job and my desire is not to take out Facebook. I have no idea, no intention of maligning anybody or misrepresenting anything. I think it's an important story. I think in some ways the most important story of our time. And I think that the stakes are so extraordinary in the private, personal dimension of this story that a lot of people don't know. And I think that it is a service to, it's an act of civic storytelling, which I like to think of the great Shakespearean histories as that. They are a kind of creation of Englishness. They are an act of social storytelling, and they're about power. So, yeah, it's a complicated process. We were at Amazon. We were going to make the show at Amazon. I wrote 2 scripts, and then I wrote the full season outline, and General Counsel in Seattle decided that there was too much exposure. I think one of the executives said, we are starting to understand that we cannot put Jeff in a position that he would be in to receive the kind of scrutiny he's going to receive if we make this show. So that was it. We were done. And then Claire Foy got involved. She read a version that she read the pilot and wanted to play Sheryl Sandberg. That got a lot of people interested. We're going to go back out to market. The week we were going out to market, Facebook drops a cease and desist letter in Deadline Hollywood, which is the big sort of news site for insiders in Hollywood. So AMC, which was very interested, sort of suddenly disappeared. A couple of other buyers disappeared. But it was interesting. I think, you know, a lot of the journalists who cover some of these tech companies feel that the tech companies are in their communications, hacked their emails or whatever. You know, some of the timing of some of these things is interesting. Let me just leave it at that. So, you know, there's a lot of challenges. I think at the end of the day, HBO seems to have the will to really make the show. So hopefully we will.
It's interesting to deal with characters who are very publicly perceived as villainous at this point.
Yeah.
Do you have an interest in writing against that, with that, or are you just putting public perception out of your mind as you go in to tell a story?
Well, public perception is a very, very key factor in both Mark and Cheryl's own sense of themselves. And there is a real interesting public-private divide in this story and in the story of how these events unfold. What is said in private, what is said in meetings, what is said at home to intimates, to friends, is different than what corporate liability and profit incentive and the immediacy of crisis management, and the interplay between those things. I love Mark and Cheryl. I can't not. I had an interesting experience where I realized one day that I'd had a conversation with somebody where I judged Mark in this conversation. And then when I went back to write, there was a scene taking place on his Hawaiian estate. I realized that I no longer felt like I lived on the Hawaiian estate. That when I didn't judge Mark, I felt like the Hawaiian estate was mine. And so I could be there. But then when I judged him, so it's a tricky balance. I have to maintain a certain kind of objectivity. The facts are the facts. Drama is drama. Things have to be spoken. There is an arc. There are strong reversals. But I have to also dwell inside. I think we have a moment to announce potential Q&A.
Fantastic.
If you have any questions, if you can come to the mic, that would be wonderful.
If you have any questions, you can come to the mic.
And while you're talking about adapting for TV, I mean, Homeland Elegies is also
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
I'm curious what Alexandra is curious about that project.
Yeah, I'm adapting a novel that I wrote that was the occasion for the profile in the New Yorker called Homeland Elegies. I'm adapting that for FX with Kumail Nanjiani.
What stage is that in at this point?
Playing me. We're still early, It's going well, but it's a complicated book to adapt for TV. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did people, yes, we have a question.
We do have a question.
Hi. Okay, that was a little loud. When you were describing the story you're writing as a Shakespearean drama, it was interesting. I started thinking about a lot of Shakespeare falls into a comedy or a tragedy, and I was wondering, do you think of this story as a comedy or a tragedy? And then also, if comedy can be a form of criticism, and there can either be a generous criticism in comedy, or there can be a very cutting and mean-spirited criticism in comedy. So I was just wondering how you think about, if you think about your piece at all in those terms, and how it takes shape, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Sure, thank you for that. Northrop Frye, the great Canadian critic, another great pedagogue of the tradition, has a very interesting series of modes that he talks about representation, and at the bottom is the ironic mode where we live now, where we, the viewers, the readers, are much better than the characters that we see, and then there's there's a succession of modes that rise in terms of the so-called nobility of the characters. Maybe the characters are just like us, or they're a little bit better than us, and that would be called high mimesis. And high mimesis is a kind of watered-down version of what Aristotle would call tragedy, where you have heroic characters who are better than us, who fall. And I am a writer of high mimesis, and the dilemma is that I'm a writer of high mimesis in a time of irony. And so the question, in a sense, that you've asked me is, am I working in an ironic or comic mode, meaning are the characters worse than us, or are they like us? And my response is they're actually a little bit better than us, or they're a little bit higher in their being than us because of their power. And that's the way in which it's reflective not of neither tragedy nor comedy in the Shakespearean tradition, but of what Shakespeare would eventually be known of as a writer of history, the history plays. Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Henry VI cycle, Richard II, Richard III. Thank you.
We have a question on this side.
Hi. Thank you both for this very thought-provoking conversation. This question is for Ayad. I read Homeland Elegies without knowing much about it, and for about halfway through the book, I thought it was really a memoir. And at a certain point, I realized, no, this is too well-structured to be a memoir. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how that book started. Did you think of it as a memoir initially and then turn it into fiction? Or how did that come about? And I'm curious as to how your playwriting adds to your fiction writing, or what's some of the interplays between those two different forms?
Thank you. The subject of the fiction or nonfiction of it all was quite an interesting one to navigate with Alex during the profile, because I sensed at times, of course, you inquiring if something was maybe true or not true, and in indirect ways, and then you quite wonderfully in the piece said he would deny it only to then affirm it and then deny it again. When I started to write Homeland Elegies, my mother had passed away. My father was drinking himself into oblivion. Trump was our president. My familial situation and the national mood had converged, the personal and the political, in ways that also dovetailed with a certain personal crisis that I was living through emotionally. And I started to write. It just, the language poured out of me. Those sentences just started pouring out of me. And what was clear to me was that there was an organic momentum to this particular voice. And that voice was my voice. But then when I had to start referring to events from that voice's life, I discovered I had the freedom to make up any events I wanted to keep the voice moving. And for a good 100 pages, I didn't care. And then I started to realize, okay, this is complicated because this is me, I guess. Everyone's going to think it's me, but I've made up a bunch of stuff that's not me. So now what do I do? So I just kept going, and then I started to play with it. And I'm a deep, deep fan, like super fan of certain Philip Roth works, like Counterlife and Operation Shylock. And so I started thinking about that. And I started thinking about how that interplay and the representation, and of course, nobody was going to know that I was doing this because everyone's going to assume that it was a memoir. I mean, I still get, the question I get more than any other is, what was it like to discover you had a half-sister when you went to a strip club and discovered that you met your half-sister at the strip club? And that's an apex moment in the book when I thought, okay, now of course the audience is going to know, the reader's going to know that it's not true, because whoever meets their half-sister they didn't know they had at a strip club while she's giving them a lap dance, right? Of course that's fiction. Like it's satire. Like how could it? No. Oh my God. I mean, Chris Jones at the Chicago Tribune, his review was like, I wish he had told me that he had a half-sister in Queens. So, I just let it happen, and then I knew, in a way, I was playing with something that was very of our time, this staging of the self and the Instagram of it all, and the reality television. I describe it as a kind of literary form of reality TV with episodes, one's about syphilis, and one's about, my dad's court case, and one's about, you have these A stories and then the B story and all of that, so.
I think this question is more for Alexandra, although Ayad might have an answer as well. I teach creative writing at Johns Hopkins University, and my students are trying to find a career in writing. And some of them are interested in being critics of some kind or another. So I wanted to ask you what you would recommend to them to do in an environment where newspapers and magazines are no longer having theater or even book critics, et cetera. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to navigate, so I sympathize with your students. I mean, my very first response, which may sound banal in the extreme, for which I apologize, is to write at school for a newspaper. And the reason I'm sorry that sounds banal, but I say it, is because I often get this question, and I'm very surprised by the number of people who our students have newspapers, magazines, et cetera, that are right there directly available, but who are kind of looking to jump over. It's so important to write where the opportunities are if you're in an institutional setting, because they're there and because you can hone your voice, the craft of criticism, your taste, all of these things. Then out in the world, this is, I hope, not too much of a cop-out answer. Find where you really love to read and criticism, and read pretty broadly. You know, I've even experienced at a place like the New Yorker, the closing of one door, which is reliance on print advertising, and then the chaotic but very fruitful opening of another door. My own career trajectory probably would not have been, I mean, definitely would not have been possible 10 years earlier, certainly not 20 years earlier, because suddenly the internet was there and the internet wanted voices on it. And legacy publications, not to mention a whole host of new younger publications, which are popping up and closing down and popping up all the time, needed voices. You know, new magazines are being formed all the time. I take this as a very encouraging note. The one at the top of my mind right now is The Drift. It's just come on the scene. It attacked me and a bunch of other writers in its first issue, and I thought, yeah, like I think a lot of people felt that way. So I would encourage them to read criticism really widely first, follow the critics they like, and I think it could lead to something good.
So because we have only 5 minutes left, we have 2 last questions. Can we hear them both at once? That would be great if you can start your question, and then we'll take your question.
Sure. By the way, I really love both your work and really appreciate hearing you speak. I feel like you know how to provoke really interesting questions. One question I've seen in both art and criticism that's come up a lot lately, particularly with art about living people, I'm thinking specifically of The Dropout, is how to hold people accountable while also like offering them the empathy that we, seek to offer in art making and criticism. And I'm curious to both of you, like how you approach that, and I think it applies both to like fiction and also like offering an artist empathy while also holding them accountable for the work that they've put on the page or on the stage.
Thank you so much. Can we hear your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, both of you, for the event today. I teach at NYU, and I find that a lot of my students they are not interested in reading criticism in the Times, certainly, sometimes elsewhere as well. There is this idea that these institutions represent a history that they find to be problematic, and they tend to look online and social media for if they want to engage in any sort of critical discourse about art. And I was just wondering what both of you thought about social media, the voices that are on social media. There is obviously a lot of vitriol on social media, but there are also some gems that are out there. And so how do you navigate that? How do you negotiate that, thinking about as an artist, but then also as a critic as well?
Such great questions.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll take that one. And,
yeah, perfect.
That's a fascinating question that you asked. And I think goes to, my answer will sort of reveal what my own interests are. My interests are in the eternal in human affairs. And so the inevitable, invariable industrial exercise in redemption or virtue signaling or the reification of certain ideas or power structures or whatever it may be doesn't interest me. I'm not interested in that dimension of the making of the work. I recognize that it may function in some way to make a show about Mark and Cheryl, may somehow hold them to account, or it may somehow redeem them. I don't care. I want to use that story to reveal something eternal about being human. which is neither a redemptive nor an it's both. As I think any great articulation of a high mimetic or a tragic, I do think of myself as a tragedy, and I said that once at an event, everyone started laughing. I don't think anybody at that particular event had ever even heard that there was such a thing. You could be a tragedy, and why would you want to do that? So I think that while all of that's important, and it may actually be the reason, for example, that HBO wants to make the show. Maybe they feel like they want to hold Facebook to account or something like, who knows? It's hard to know what, but my interest as an artist is in the vertical dimension of the meaning of the story as opposed to its horizontal orientation, if that makes sense.
I totally agree with you that there are gems on critical gems on social media. I can think of a few just right off the top of my head, some really fascinating threads that I've read recently. I find it very exciting that's out there, and also a little bit liberating as a critic as well. Again, because I think it's quite liberating when there are more voices around in general. I don't really want to be the authority. I want to be maybe a authority, but I don't want to be the authority. And so that's why I think more voices, that's one big reason I think more voices the better, both in professional criticism and online. You know, and specifically, I can find it freeing when sometimes I'm tiptoeing around something, dancing around, and I will see something on social media, and I think, oh my God, that person hated this. And they just came right out and said it, and okay, you know, I'm not alone. That said, yeah, when you have the New Yorker over your name, you have a lot more power than when you don't. But again, to me, it also helps hone the opportunity for criticism to really think through something rather than to provide a thumbs up or thumbs down, which again, a thoughtful thread on social media can do, or it can be a more immediate, I hated this, I loved this. I never want to write I hated this, I love this kind of piece. I mean, those emotions or those judgments come across, but I want to get deeper. And I think if critics are going to earn the readership of your students and of people in general, we have to be really engaged with that kind of writing, because you know sometimes I'll see, I love reading, I'm so grateful that there are no comments on New Yorker articles, but I also love reading the comments on other people's articles. And one response I see a lot, especially in Times reviews, is, you know, hey, this wasn't for you, and that's okay, but you're not really, this piece wasn't for you, but maybe it was for me. And I think that is a really interesting response to a work of criticism that that the critic can take into account, but also one, you know, I think it kind of puts the onus on us to understand our own points of view better, because it could be that the work is for them, but differently. Yeah.
Alex Schwartz.
Ayad Akhtar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the two of you.